Hello, and welcome to this edition of the Right Hassle Real Estate Rundown. My name's Andrew Jones. I'm a partner in the commercial real estate team, and I'm joined again by my fellow colleague, James Frost.
Hi, Andy.
Hi, James. Today we're going to be talking about the potential ban on upward-only rent reviews, and I say potential because this was announced way back on the 10th of July, so we've had a few weeks to digest it. There's been quite a bit of comment in the media, and James and I have been looking at how this has impacted investors and potential tenants, occupiers, landlords, etc., from sort of slightly different angles. But let's kick off, James, with what is exactly being proposed.
Yeah, so this was a bit of a bolt from the blue actually in July, and I think possibly some of the frustration actually to this is the lack of consultation. But in a nutshell, what we're talking about here is a plan that was announced in the English Devolution and Community Empowerment Bill that was, as you say, announced in mid-July. It hasn't been through second reading yet, and there'll be plenty of lobbying. So the truth is it may change a lot over the next sort of 6 to 12 months. But where we're at now is a suggestion of banning upwards only rent reviews, by which we mean increases to the rent which are uncertain at the point of entering into the lease. Now, that could have an impact on a number of rent review mechanisms that we see routinely. So it's not just going to be an effect that we see on in a particular market or a particular industry, because this will affect upwards only open market valuations, index linked, particularly where we see caps and collars at the moment. And it will also impact turnover rent ratchet rent reviews, which are quite commonplace in shopping centres, for example. So it's a potentially wide-reaching development, and it's taken the market to some extent by surprise.
And it's only going to affect new leases when it comes into, if and when it comes into force. It's not going to be applied retrospectively, is my understanding.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it'll probably impact the negotiation of new leases once it comes into force, and actually it might start impacting negotiation of leases now as landlords and tenants start getting their ducks in a row and thinking about this sort of draft legislation.
Yeah, I think that ultimately leases that are entered into now or over the course of the next 6-12 months that include these upwards only rent reviews as we currently know them, the early signs are that they're not going to be impacted by these changes. But I think what we will find is that the market begins to put its thinking cap on as to how it can adapt to something like this. The provisions in the bill are, on the face of it, drafted quite widely with the sort of clear intention to prevent clever firms from, coming up with ways around it. And it sort of speaks to the intention of the bill rather than a specific mechanism that's prohibited. But the uncertainty is going to flow through, and as we within law firms sort of begin to see different variations of approach, I should say, on giving clarity to rent.
So you can't contract out of it as it's drafted at the moment. The parties can't agree that this doesn't apply.
Well, it's an interesting point, because who knows how it could develop over the next year, but the current version of it doesn't seem to include that.
And in fact, it's got some anti-avoidance measures that specifically say that any clauses that try and get around it avoid.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's pretty draconian.
It is pretty draconian. I sort of look at this particularly from the landlord and investor perspective. So I don't particularly view it in a hugely positive way, because I think it brings in a lack of certainty. I think it's going to have the potential to spook the market in terms of valuations. I think it will affect lender assumptions and funding viability. I'm interested in your perspective, Andy, particularly with the work that you do from an occupier perspective. On the face of it, it feels perhaps like a bit of an olive branch to occupiers who have been facing a lot over the last few years.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the intention of the bill is to basically empower tenants and help them on struggling high streets. And I think it's interesting that the way the bill has been framed is that it's aimed at invigorating high streets, But actually, the bill as drafted goes much wider than that. It's not just the retail sector that they're talking about banning these upward only rent reviews. It includes office and even industrial and healthcare. So it does feel a little bit like potential sledgehammer to crack a nut. But having said that, clearly high street tenants have been struggling with high costs, high rents, and therefore having upward and downward rent reviews may help them in the future in a falling market. Do a deal now, you've got a rent review in 5 years' time. If market rents have fallen, like we saw over sort of the COVID period and even since then, the tenants can then get the benefit of a falling market without having to re-gear, renegotiate, exercise breaks that they don't really want to and have to disrupt their business.
Which on the face of it doesn't seem unreasonable, does it? That actually market rents are responsive to the market that they sit within.
Yeah. My fear is that the market will respond to the legislation rather than the other way around.
Yeah.
And that landlords will start insisting on perhaps shorter term leases, even potentially looking at how this interacts with the Landlord and Tenant Act 1954, which gives tenants security of tenure. Landlords may then start saying, well, we'll only grant you 3-year leases, 5-year leases, with the ability to terminate and kick the tenant out at the end of that 3 to 5 year period. Not necessarily because they want to take vacant occupation, but because they actually want to renegotiate those terms, and puts the landlord in a much stronger position with a sitting tenant, a special tenant, if you like, special buyer, having to renegotiate where they know the cost of moving could be very disruptive to the business. So my fear is that it'll drive the market to shorter term leases, which will be outside the Act, which actually will not be beneficial to that retail market.
I've been finding that index-linked rent reviews are far more common than open market rent reviews, because I think that both parties seem to appreciate the higher degree of certainty that presents. And I do wonder whether index-linked rent reviews, given that they're already so common, will be even more common if this comes into force. And actually, in light of that, whether it really is necessary.
The only challenge around that is where we've been with inflation over the last few years, with CPI running at 10% at one point. And if we had another inflationary environment, that could be detrimental to tenants. What I actually think we might see is stepped rent increases, so built in 3%, 2% a year. And as I understand it, the bill doesn't ban fixed rent increases.
No, quite.
And I think investors are always looking for an increase. If they enter in a 10, 15-year lease, they want to have a little bit of uplift, which is where you often see that collar and cap.
Yeah.
Because the collar allows a little bit of revenue increase for investors, but also gives an occupier some certainty to know that their rent costs aren't going to go above the cap. So,
and of course, caps aren't targeted with this legislation, so the caps would remain, but the collars are being removed. But then in practice, the last time I was researching, the last time that the index actually went down, the last time we had sort of negative inflation, if you like, it was in 2009 for RPI and 2015 for CPI. Certainly in the CPI case, it wasn't sustained for long. And you wonder whether an index-linked rent review gives a degree of certainty that the rent is likely to still go up, albeit that we no longer have the collar where you might see a minimum increase of 2%. You would reasonably expect it to go up at least to some extent. And speaking back to that market sensitivity point, if the market has been hit hard enough for us to be seeing a negative index across the market, then you wonder whether actually seeing that reflected in rents might not be the worst thing for sort of general stability.
Absolutely. I mean, my biggest fear is that it's going to impact the appetite for investment into high streets, actually. And that could actually be quite counterproductive, because more and more voids on high streets means the less viability of high streets. So that is, I think, a risk of the legislation. I think I think there's a long way to go on this. What's the status of the bill at the moment, James?
Well, as I say, it hasn't even had second reading. So, the first we heard of it was on the 10th of July. There's been a lot of talk since then, and I think that will be a sign of things to come in terms of the role that the market will want to play in this. It has, as we've discussed, sort of potentially very wide-ranging implications, both for sort of occupier market and from a valuation perspective. So there are lots of people that are going to want to have their say on how this goes through Parliament. There's no date yet for second reading. And so I think, as I say, a reasonable estimate would be a minimum of 6 months, probably more like 12 months, for this to come into law if it does. And by that time, the truth is we don't know what it will look like. But it's interesting seeing the amount of conversation that this has prompted. And I think it is going to be an interesting one to watch and see how it develops.
Yeah, I think it will create some almost some greater flexibility in the rental market, certainly on the retail side. I think landlords will have this in mind when they're starting to negotiate new deals, and so will tenants. So I think it'll be interesting to see how it pans out and where we land with it. So I think it's very much watch this space.
Absolutely.
So yeah, thanks for your input on that. It's really helpful.